So, what has the far-left ideology looked like in the US? What social forces have shaped the leftist ideology during the middle part of the 20th century? And what is the ultimate goal of far-left extremists? During the 1960s and 70s, at the height of the Vietnam and civil rights movements, far-left terrorists were responsible for some significant violence, including numerous bombings, armed robberies, and violence against the police in an attempt to arouse the consciousness of the general public. Far-left extremism has often been described as revolutionary, where the goal is to fundamentally change the government to better meet the needs of the people. The ideology is anti-militarism and anti-imperialism. This is the belief that the U.S. should not be interfering with or setting up colonies in other countries to control their affairs and exploit their people and resources. Far leftists were against the U.S.'s approach to foreign policy during the Cold War and adamantly against the Vietnam War. The ideology is against social and racial inequality. It is largely centered around Marxist socialism, believing a complete revolution toward a different economic system was necessary to bridge the massive gap between the rich and the poor, between whites and other races. In that vein, it is naturally anti-capitalist, believing capitalism is an evil system that exploits less powerful citizens and third world nations to assemble tremendous wealth in the hands of a small number of powerful interests. One of the key developments in far-left extremism in the U.S. is the Students for a Democratic Society, not because they were extremists, but because this is where many activists who would later engage in terrorism got their start. It was a large student activist movement in the 1960s whose goal was not to focus on a single issue, but to critique American society more generally. Again, they were anti-militarism. As U.S. involvement with Vietnam grew, so did the radicalization of their views. And they were not alone. One 1969 poll found over 1 million students considered themselves revolutionaries. The group made national news with demonstrations at political events and on college campuses. They also published a manifesto promoting civil disobedience, participatory democracy, and workers' rights. The group disintegrated largely due to disagreements on the tactics they should use. There were splits between Marxist and non-Marxist members, those who thought change should originate from the top down within the system or bottom up from the people, the masses. Another important left-wing group is the Weather Underground. They were a militant splinter group from the SDS formed in 1969 who were willing to use violence to seek social change, namely the end of American imperialism. They carried out several bombings of government buildings and banks, often clashed with police, and targeted their efforts toward Washington, D.C. and multinational corporations. The group disbanded in 1977, a few years after the Vietnam War came to a close. The Black Panther Party is another important far-left group, active from the late 1960s through the early 1980s. They advocated for racial justice, including equal housing and education, and the release of blacks from prison, who they saw as political prisoners. Though most were not violent, they did believe in using violence when they saw it necessary as a means of self-defense. This led to numerous altercations with police over the years, a few of which resulted in the deaths of several officers. A more extreme spin-off group, the Black Liberation Army, consisting largely of Black Panther members, aimed to liberate black people from oppression by taking up arms against the government. The Black Liberation Army was linked to over 70 violent incidents and over 10 police officer deaths during the early 1970s. Both the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers declined throughout the 1970s before disbanding completely in the early 1980s. Though there were many other far-left groups of that era, these were some of the most well-known. These groups largely dissipated over time, and this type of far-left terrorism largely morphed into mostly non-violent political activism by the 1980s. Fast forward to present day, some potentially violent far-left elements harkening back to this era have seen a resurgence in recent years in the form of black nationalism. Listed here are a few examples of these groups that espouse the black nationalist ideology. Though certainly not all are linked to violence or other criminal activity, they do have the potential to attract extremists willing to take action on their beliefs. Several fatal shooting attacks have been carried out by black nationalists, along with other acts of violence. Since 2016, at least 15 people have been killed, over half of whom were police officers, and numerous others have been injured. These deaths are linked to 4 major incidents, all shootings. 2 ambush attacks, killing officers in Texas and Louisiana in 2016, and 2 subsequent shootings in 2017 and 2019. These are the first incidents of fatal violence from black nationalists since the 1980s. It remains to be seen if black nationalist violence will continue, or if these were just a few isolated incidents, but it's certainly important to keep an eye on. Interestingly too, there has even been some crossover mixing among some black nationalists with sovereign citizen ideology, which we'll cover next week. But now, let's discuss a different type of far-left terrorism that was prominent from the early 1990s through the mid-2000s and even into the early 2010s. Eco-terrorism. There are two major eco-terrorist groups, the Animal Liberation Front, or ALF, and the Earth Liberation Front, or ELF. The ALF began in England in the 1970s as an outgrowth of Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd's Conservation Society, while the ELF began in 1992 in England as a splinter group of the non-terrorist group Earth First. So, you can see that many of these terrorist groups are formed by members of non-terrorist activist groups, much like the far-left groups from the 1960s and 70s. The ideology underlying this type of terrorism is referred to as deep ecology, the belief that all living things are equal and should be allowed to live and thrive regardless of their perceived usefulness to humans. They also believe that the planet and the animals that live on it are in imminent danger and that people are the problem. They believe corporations are responsible for the threat facing the planet due to the destruction of the environment and the government is allowing to happen. And importantly, they believe that there is an immediate need to defend the environment and animals using violence if necessary. Now let's take a look at the crimes committed by ELF and ALF extremists in the U.S. Eco-terrorists differ from other terrorists in the U.S. in one major way. Their aim is to damage their targets through the desecration and destruction of property while avoiding human casualties. In fact, I haven't found any documented cases of humans killed due to an eco-terrorist attack. That does not mean they have not been majorly destructive toward property, though. Between 1995 and 2010, ELF and ALF extremists committed 239 documented acts of violence against property. 62% were bombings, 38% were arsons. Most bombings involved incendiary devices, bombs or explosives that are designed specifically to produce fires. Environmental rights extremists usually targeted private homes and vehicle dealerships, while animal rights extremists usually targeted meat processing plants and university labs using animals in their research. They are typically motivated, of course, by a general need to protect the environment and animals, but they're also against urban sprawl, or the constant expansion of urban areas into previously untouched land, and also anti-corporation and business development in general. What are some of the characteristics of far-left ALF and ELF terrorists? Well, all these offenders were white, about 1/4 were male, just over half were college-educated, and none had military backgrounds. They tended to be younger, with average age in the late 20s, unmarried, and reside in urban areas. And in terms of the legal responses to their crimes, arrests were made in only about 1/3 of these incidents. One reason for this is that the perpetrators are difficult to identify as they go to great lengths to conceal their identities. A related reason is that they operate in small groups that are responsible for a large number of incidents. Informal cells with no hierarchical structure are common, so there are fewer opportunities for law enforcement to identify and intercept their plans of attack. Eco-terrorists generally operate under the idea of what's known as leaderless resistance, which involves acting in small cells or on an individual basis without direction from a centralized organization. Instead of taking orders from movement leaders, eco-terrorists take it upon themselves to engage in direct action, a philosophy promoting the direct engagement in economic and political acts to achieve their goals. For extremists, this could cross the line into engaging in violent and other criminal acts. In the case of eco-terrorists, it involves obstructing or halting activities of those they see as causing harm to animals and the environment. Eco-terrorists are not the only ones to follow this model. Many far-right movements, jihadists, and Antifa on the left have adopted leaderless resistance. We'll explore this further when we talk about terrorist organizational structures. One question to consider is whether eco-terrorists pose a significant future threat against human targets. There are differing views on this. One argument is that eco-terrorists do not pose a threat to humans. These groups actively discourage violence against humans. There have been no human casualties to this point, despite the large numbers of bombings and arsons against property. There is no charismatic leader to motivate them to commit violence against humans. And most members of these extremist groups continue to also remain engaged in the broader activist movement. And since they have acted in a way that has avoided violence against persons to this point, there's every reason to believe they will continue to do so in the future. The opposing argument is that eco-terrorists do in fact pose a threat to human targets. Some of the rhetoric used by these groups is dehumanizing to those who they target. Violence can easily be rationalized as a self-defense. It is possible that feelings of being targeted by authorities can lead to retaliation. Some environmentalists have been known to morph into what have been referred to by some as green anarchists, with wider political agendas and broadening grievances and targets. Eco-terrorists already have a record of using sophisticated weaponry and causing tremendous amounts of property damage. Most of the targets are private homes. They may actively try not to harm anyone, but what if someone dies in a fire set to a home, or if a pet is killed? Needless to say, that would certainly run counter to the goal of protecting animals. And finally, the movement is primarily made up of young males, who are the most violent-prone portion of the population. So, these are some of the arguments for and against eco-terrorists as posing a threat to human targets in the future.